Okay, let's begin the series on opening principles. There are several opening principles that we have to adhere to, and we can say that there's a lot of subtleties and nuances to opening play. However, for now, what we want to focus on are the three main objectives of the opening phase of any game, and we should always keep these objectives in mind. So, as you guys can see, the three main objectives are obtaining central control, developing your pieces, completing your development, and also making sure that you bring your king to safety. So within central control, we can consider the core or the heart of the center as the main four central squares, which we'll look at in a second. But we should also keep in mind the slightly lesser known concept of the expanded center. And central control also ties in very strongly with space. One of the big benefits of having good control over the center is that it automatically gives your pieces a lot of space to maneuver. So we'll also be checking that out in the section on central control with the examples that I'll provide shortly. The second area to look at is development. So put simply, that just means get your pieces out. I think every chess player is familiar with the nightmare situation where you haven't completed your development in time, your opponent has, and there's a heavy price to pay. So that's the main thing that we look at. But also, we may very quickly, it's perhaps a little bit more of an advanced topic, but we may take a quick look at the point of hindering your opponent's development, right? It's a little bit not entirely about completing your own development at times, but it's also, you should keep an eye on if you're able to slow down your opponent's development as he's trying to achieve the same goal as you. And last but not least, king safety. So protect your monarch. And I noted, this I think is self-explanatory, but the second point in the slide of aids development, what I mean by this actually is that when you castle, you are completing your development as well as bringing your king to safety. So the two concepts are, as in many occasions in chess, the two are intertwined. And it also connects the rooks, so we'll keep that in mind as well. And finally, I note that kingside castling is more common. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that, and we're going to show some examples as to why, in general, you should be castling on the king side. Okay, so that's it as far as an introduction or an overview of the opening principles is concerned. And well, let's get down to the nitty gritty and look at some examples and zone in on the different topics. So the first opening principle that we can discuss is central control. But what exactly do we mean by the center to begin with? Well, in the introduction, I commented that there were two types of center to keep in mind: the heart of the center and also the expanded center. So the heart of the center is what most people think about when they consider the center, and that is four key squares here: the d4 square, the d5 square, the e4 square, and the e5 square. We can say that this is the core center. And as either side, we really want to try and gain control of the center, to challenge for it. However, we should say a couple of things. The first thing is that if we're white or if we're black, in both cases we want to pursue the center, but because if we have the white pieces, we move first, we have a greater chance of establishing strong central control. So we should keep that in mind, that in general as black, we often play an opening that tries to sort of neutralize white's attempt of controlling the center, tries to kind of take almost 50% share of central control, and if they can get just under that, well, we're okay with that because white had the first move. If you're white, on the other hand, you really want to be a little bit more ambitious in obtaining that central control. So that's the first point. The second point is that when we speak of the center, we don't have to limit ourselves only to these four squares, because we should really think of the center as almost, like the center of a circle, and that expands outwards. And so we can talk about this point that I mentioned in the introduction, the expanded center. And so what is that? Let's show the expanded center. It seems rather intuitive, I think. But the point is that, for example, if we have a couple of pawns here on d4 and e4, and we have supporting pawns on c3 and f3, well, we have really strong central control. Stronger than if we have still our pawns on d4 and e4, but we have no pawns on the c file or on the f file. Because one thing that we should keep in mind is that in many situations, you may have, let's imagine a situation where black has a pawn and plays this move, c5, like in a Sicilian defense, and suddenly he's targeting that pawn on d4. Well, as white, we maybe have a pawn on c2, and we play this move c3, and if he takes us, we take back. So what's happened is that we've maintained our central control because this c pawn basically became a d pawn, right, after this series of exchanges. So in other words, it's important to keep in mind that the pawns on the c file and the pawns on the f file, they can support the center. They're more central and they're worth more in general than, say, a b pawn or any of these pawns, a pawn, b pawn, g pawn, or h pawn. So do keep that in mind. So we've discussed the heart of the center and the expanded center, and now we understand the definitions, right? So this is the heart of the center, and then the expanded center are all the squares that you can see around the heart of the center. So in general, when we think of central control, we want to get onto one of those green squares, but we should always keep in mind the surrounding squares and their importance. And the other point that we need to discuss is space and why this central control leads to more space. But I think the best way to do that is by using examples. So let us now turn our attention to a real life example. This was taken from a game played by Greco, Gioacchino Greco. I suppose one of the earliest masters, chess masters, of the early 17th century. So back when the chess principles were not very developed, a lot of important chess concepts, rules had yet to be discovered. So in that sense, they're very illustrative games, which I highly recommend. Okay, so let's see what happened. e4 was played, e5, bishop c4, bishop to c5, queen to e2, queen to e7, and now white played the move f4. Nowadays, players would generally avoid this kind of approach of queen e2, bringing the queen out a little bit too early, or f4, weakening the king. But back then, it was a common approach. So black captured with f4, and we noticed one thing, the first point of the center. Well, we had mentioned that these are the four key central squares. Of course, the two natural pawns are the e pawn that can get onto e4, as we can see here, and the d pawn for white in the case would be d4, and for black it would be the respective squares e5 and d5. But now we see that by offering up a pawn like this and black accepting the pawn, we can see this now, here, f4, and now black accepts the pawn. Well, we see that black goes from having a counterpart on the e file and a counterpart on the d file to still having the counterpart on the d file. But now white has a central pawn majority. White continued his development, knight f3, and black played g5. Now he's making another pawn move, and his king is a little bit unsafe, but on the other hand, black is a pawn up. d4, and here black played the move bishop to b4, check, and now we see the move c3 in response. Now we see again the point of the expanded center. Well, now white has the core center, And he also has a little bit of support here from the c-pawn. So if at any point black were to try and challenge in this way and capture the d-pawn, maybe white will be able to recapture with the c-pawn. In the meantime, black is spending a lot of time. We'll talk about that in the very near future, about the importance of development. So black played the move bishop to a5, and now white played h4, trying to undermine this structure here. Black plays f6 and is trying to hang on to his pawn. Notice that he could not have played the move h6 because after pawn takes g5, if pawn takes g5, the rook would have been hanging. So black also does not want to play g4 because then after a move like knight e5, well, we immediately see the importance of that center and how it gives you some access to key squares, right? So in this case, the pawn on d4 is supporting that e5 square. And so the knight can jump to e5, from which it can create some very, very serious threats here on f7, combining with the bishop. And also, of course, there is an attack on this pawn and on this pawn. Black is in a lot of trouble. That's why he went instead for the move f6. But we see that after f6, h takes g5, f takes g5. Well, again, we go back to the concept of the expanded center, and we see that now white still has his core central control. But we see that this f pawn went first from f7 to f6, and then f takes g5. So now it can no longer challenge the center. Let's imagine a different situation where white, rather than play this move h4, let's say that white had played a move like e5. Well, now black could consider such a move as f6 at some point. Maybe right here it may not be the best move, but the point is that if white then sits around and does nothing, black at some moment may be able to capture this way. And in so doing, he's traded the f pawn in the expanded center after f6 for one of white's core central pawns. And that trade in general is going to suit black. Because, well, what can we say? Well, there is no longer two pawns in the center, there is only one. So let's return to the game. Bishop to a5, pawn to h4, and f6. Pawn takes, and now white undermines black's pawn here, which is, again, not in the core center, but in the expanded center, undermines it and also opens up lines of attack. We'll see why that's important very, very quickly. g4 is played, knight to e5. And we see here, again, the benefit of that strong control of many squares that a strong center gives you. Notice how these two pawns, notice how influential they are. So white has great control of the board. So after g4, knight to e5, f3, black achieves a strong protected pass pawn, but after queen to e3, white is threatening to first take the pawn on g4 and then take the pawn on f3. Black played knight to f6 to defend the pawn, but fell for a cute tactic, knight to g6. Now the point is, black cannot capture because of rook takes h8. And notice the importance of that central control, that the knight in the first place was on e5 because it had, after the move knight e5, it had the support of that strong central pawn on d4. And from there, it was able to first target g4. So black had to respond to that, played knight f6. It turned out that black missed an even stronger threat, which was knight to g6, forking the queen and the rook and taking advantage of the fact that if black captures the knight, the rook on h8 is falling with check. So black ignored that, played queen to g7, knight takes rook, queen takes. And now let's go back to the point of the center, e5. And that's one of the big risks of central control for your opponent, right? If you have a lot of, or say if your opponent has the center, in this case, from black's perspective, you have to worry not only about all the squares that are already controlled, but you have to worry about whether white will at any given moment push the d-pawn and take control of other squares, or push the e-pawn. And in this case, the pawn push to e5 is really problematic for black, because that knight is attacked, has to move, and it has no good jumps. It cannot go here because of the bishop's control. It cannot go here because that's controlled by the rook. So inevitably it goes to g8. Now white plays queen to g5, double attack, knight to e7, and the position is truly horrible. A few more moves were played, but now white is up a lot of material, still has that strong center, and black has been unable to complete his development, which is something that we'll talk about in more detail very soon. So hope that was a nice illustration of the importance of the center. So let us now take a look at another game by the same player with the white pieces, Mr. Greco. And he opened with 1e4, e5, bishop to c4, bishop c5, queen e2, again, queen e7, f4, and black captures on g1. We have yet to focus on development, but notice that here black is exchanging his developed bishop for the white undeveloped knight on g1. So already black needs to be very careful about doing such things, because the consequences after rook takes g1, well, white still has that developed bishop and black has lost his counterpart, so he's very quickly falling behind in development. Black now captures on f4, and now we talk about what we're focusing on right now, which is the center, right? So no points for guessing that white continued with the move d4. Now he's got that core center, and he's opened up the diagonal for his bishop, so he wants to at some point capture on f4, recover his pawn. So black gave this check. White played g3, pawn takes, and rook takes g3. So we notice that white not only has the center firmly under his control, but also greater development. Black played the move knight f6, and now white played the move knight to c3, simply defending on e4, but also setting a little trap. Black took the bait with the move knight to h5, hitting the rook, and, well, it seems as though white is simply going to be losing an exchange, because he cannot move the rook since the rook is pinned due to the placement of the king. However, it will come as no surprise to seasoned chess players that when somebody has such great development as this, and great central control, to move a knight once is good, but to move it twice, to move that piece twice, is wasting time with the king here without your development completed, and this can have nasty tactical consequences. So white here played a very beautiful move. He played bishop takes f7 check. Now that may seem as sort of a difficult move to understand, but we'll see the point now by going back and showing that when white has that central control, we've spoken about the heart of the center, we've spoken about the expanded center. We've also spoken about space and why it's important, and also how that space is being given by that central control, right? We see all of these squares under control, as well as, of course, the d4 and e4 squares. That's a lot of important squares. And the consequence of having a lot of space is that your opponent has less. And so his pieces will have less mobility, less places to run if they're attacked. And we notice here in this position, this queen on h4. Well, where can it go if it was to be attacked? Let's imagine that the queen had to move right now. Well, it could only go here, here, or here. Every other square is being controlled by white, and we see that the queen cannot maneuver along the fourth rank, along white's fourth rank, because the pawns are standing in the way. So white actually, if he played the move bishop to g5, the black queen would have nowhere to run. However, the problem with this move immediately is that black plays the response knight takes rook. And now if white takes the queen, black will capture the queen back. And he will be doing very well. And so that is why bishop takes f7 check is a very, very nice move, setting up the trap. Now after king takes f7, the point is bishop to g5, knight takes g3, and the king is now on f7 instead of on e8. The bishop lured it onto that square, and so white, rather than having to take the queen and then losing his queen, gets to play the move queen f3 check, in between move. The king has to move, and only now we capture the queen, while conserving our queen. The game finished in a couple of moves: knight to h5, queen f5 check, king to h6, and queen g5 was checkmate. Notice, by the way, how the checkmating sequence was allowed because of the pawn on e4 controlling that f5 square. So again, much like in the previous video, we see that the control of these four squares can be very, very important. And of course, in addition, we saw that the black queen had no way to maneuver along white's fourth rank because the pawns were standing in her way. So that is game 2, and I hope you enjoyed this example.